Hello, this is Professor April Dawson, and this is a recorded lecture on economic due process. This recorded lecture will focus on the Lochner era. Substantive due process has been used primarily in two areas. The first is safeguarding individual rights, specifically privacy and autonomy, and we've talked about that in pretty comprehensive detail. And substantive due process has also been used to protect economic liberties, and that's what this lecture will focus on. The main characteristic of the Lochner era was the finding by the court that freedom of contract was a basic right under the liberty and property provisions of the due process clauses of the Fifth and 14th Amendments, and the court also aggressively protecting economic rights under the due process clauses. During the Lochner era, many state laws, such as minimum wage and maximum hour laws, were declared unconstitutional as being a violation of the freedom of contract. During the Lochner era, the court also narrowly defined Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, and also found the 10th Amendment expansive in its protection of powers of the states. And we talked about the court's narrow view of the Commerce Clause last semester, and we also talked about the court's expansive view of the 10th Amendment with respect to states' rights. So during the Lochner era, the court was striking down state laws that were providing for minimum wages and maximum hours, and at the same time, the court was also striking down federal laws that were providing for minimum wages and maximum hours. The court's decisions during this time period were a reflection of the laissez-faire philosophy. So now we're going to go through very quickly a couple of the key cases during this time period. So the first, not surprisingly, is Lochner v. New York. That was a 1905 case. It was a 5-4 decision. And that case involved the Supreme Court's review of a New York law that set maximum working hours for bakers. In that case, the court articulated three major principles. The first was that the freedom of contracts was a right protected by the Due Process Clause of the Fifth and 14th Amendments. The court also found that the government could interfere with freedom of contract, but only to serve a valid police purpose of protecting public health, public safety, or public morals. And we know from our discussion last semester that states have general police power, but the federal government does not. The third major principle was that the courts would carefully scrutinize these laws to ensure that they truly served a legitimate police purpose, and that the laws were not enacted for some improper purpose like redistributing wealth or unduly regulating businesses. In reviewing the law, the court found that the law did interfere with the freedom of contract because it prevented bakery owners and bakers from contracting for as many hours of work as they wished. The court also found that protecting the health of bakers was not a sufficient justification to allow the state to interfere with freedom of contract because limiting hours for bakers was not necessary and had no relationship to public health. With respect to the law not being necessary, the court noted that bakers were not a vulnerable group and that they could negotiate on their own. And the court also found that the law had no relationship to the public health because the number of hours that bakers worked did not have any bearing on the quality of the baked goods. So the court seemed to ignore the fact that bakers were certainly more vulnerable because of the nature of the work and being in an enclosed environment with flour and dust being inhaled. And the court ultimately found that the law was unconstitutional because it violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment by interfering with freedom of contract, and it did not serve a valid police purpose. The next is Atkins v. Children's Hospital, decided in 1923, and this was a 5-3 decision. And this case involved the Supreme Court's review of a law that set the maximum wages for women and children in D.C. And although the Supreme Court had upheld a minimum hours law for women in 1908, the court here rejected the need for a minimum wage law for women. The court rejected the argument that without a minimum wage for women, they would be forced to earn money in an immoral manner. In its decision, the court stressed the growing equality of women, noting the recent adoption of the 19th Amendment, and as we know, the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. The court concluded that the law interfered with freedom of contract and did not serve any valid police power. So we see the court ruling in a manner consistent with Lochner. The next case is a case that really brought an end to the Lochner era, West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, decided in 1937. This was a 5-4 decision. And this case involved the Supreme Court's review of a Washington law that set the minimum wages for women. The court upheld the law and expressly overruled Atkins, the prior case. So an obvious question is, well, what happened between the Atkins decision and West Coast Hotel? One of the things that happened, and this certainly was not the only thing that led to the court's ending of the Lochner era, but we had FDR's court packing plan, which we talked about last semester, and we had one of the justices who oftentimes ruled with the more conservative justices on the court, Justice Owen Roberts, switched his vote and started voting more consistently with the justices who had been in the dissent. Since the Parrish decision, not one state or federal economic regulation has been found unconstitutional as infringing liberty of contracts as protected by the Due Process Clause since this case was decided. It was during this same time, 1937, that the court expanded the scope of the Commerce Clause and limited the scope of the 10th Amendment. And we talked about that change in the court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause and the 10th Amendment last semester. The final case we'll discuss is United States v. Caroline Products, which we also have discussed previously. That was a 1938 decision, and it was a 6-1 decision. That case involved the Supreme Court's review of the Federal Filled Milk Act of 1923. In upholding that law, the court stated basically that economic regulations should be upheld so long as they are supported by a conceivable rational basis, even if it cannot be proved that it was the legislature's actual intent. As long as the court can come up with a rational basis, that law will survive scrutiny. We've talked before about the famous footnote 4 in this case. And this footnote basically stated that while economic regulations would be presumed constitutional and subject to only a rational basis review, laws that interfere with individual rights or laws that restrict the ability of the political process to repeal undesirable legislation, or laws that discriminate against discrete and insular minorities would be subject to more searching judicial inquiry, or strict scrutiny. Well, that ends our discussion of economic due process. Thank you for your attention.